If I said to you, fast forward tonight live, a naked pursuit of burglars and the profile talent agency, what would you say they have in common? The answer in just a moment. Writer, producer, performer, and businessman Steve Vizard. Thanks for doing this.
Hey, John, how are you? Always good to see you. And
good.
Very lovely shirt you're wearing too. If I do say so, obviously a clearance table out the front of some store.
That's right. Yeah, it's made from tablecloth.
It's a beauty. Did you whip that up yourself, mate? Holy mackerel.
I did. You can tell by the stitching.
Looks like it'd go up in a heartbeat. Always a pleasure to talk to you, mate, and happy because you've lived a lot of my life with me. Sadly, repairing damage, trying to get a camera on me, including some very memorable trips to the UK, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yes, I'm sure we will. Yes, I have lived a lot of it, and you have done so much amazing stuff in every sphere.
Yeah.
That this could be a 10-part series.
Good. Well, if I'm getting paid by the series, which clearly I'm not, let's run it out as long as you want, mate. I'm very happy to talk. Where did you want to start? Happy to begin wherever.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the only sort of personal question. Where did you grow up?
Grew up in several spots. I first grew up in a beautiful old bluestone house called the Hawthorns that the suburb was named after, and my grandpa lived in there. And so as a little tacker, I remember being up on the window on the top floor. It was an 1839 house. It was the first house in the whole of Hawthorn. And so Rich would have stood there with just pastures and paddocks running all the way through to the city, really. But it was on a bit of a hill and you could see the skyline of the city. But from the top floor, I remember even as a sort of 5, 6, 7-year-old, to the right, there was a skipping your vinegar sign in Richmond that was flashing all the time.
Still exists.
Still there. They put it back up again. And then out to the left, I could see over the river, but just to the left was a tower. And it was a transmission tower. And it was a tower that was on top of GTV9's building in Bendigo Street in Richmond. So I remember literally as a 5 or 6-year-old, Mum and Dad telling me that is Channel 9 and TV. I was born in the year that TV was invented or came to Australia, 1956. And it was the year of the Olympics.
You're only 25.
I know. It's incredible. You need to read Stephen Hawking to work that bit out. So I was born in that year and in the year that the Olympics came to Melbourne, which was 56. Right. So it was a big year for Melbourne, but it was a big year for TV and the media. And everyone suddenly had TV sets because they were broadcasting for the first time the Olympics in Melbourne. And so it was on everyone's mind. And by the time I was 4 or 5, TV was established. It was still a new medium, and it was it was in a wooden box with a grainy black and white image that was still looked like a moon landing, but you could sort of make out images. And the image that everyone was making out was live images because everything was more or less live in those days. And coming out of Channel 9, literally a mile away, less than a mile, half a mile away from where I lived, was Graham Kennedy and Bert Newton in IMT, which was the big live show. And they had other shows in those days. You wouldn't recall this, but there was a kid show every afternoon called the Tarak Show. Mm-hmm. It was called the Tarak Show after a brand of lemonade that was big in Melbourne at the time, Tarak's Lemonade. And it was headed by Uncle Norman, who was, and they had Patty Newton, who later married, she was Patty McGrath, later married Bert Newton. They had Jeff Cork, who was King Corky, and they had a magician, and they had all different sorts of acts. And I remember being mesmerised sitting in front of that screen. But the main thing I remember Mum and Dad telling me was that it was all happening down in that studio live. And I couldn't get my head around the fact that there were live people in front of an audience there, and it was going into everyone's homes. And I still am gobsmacked by the idea that people can sit in a room like we are now, have a chat, and suddenly it's gone out to the world. And
That's
there
incredible.
was
Have you heard of the internet too? It happens on there.
the word net,
The internet, yeah, it's a new thing.
Yeah. The other thing, though, John, smartass, which was unbelievable. I don't know why I agreed to this. The other thing that I found amazing about it, which the internet, funnily enough, doesn't have, is that because it's a much more sophisticated technology, is that people aren't bound together watching the same thing at the same time.
Yes.
They were forced to do that with TV. There was no option. And now, as they're forced to do it with radio because they didn't have the technology to roll in a whole lot of replay stuff. And so a phenomena happens when that's occurring, and that is that a community is bound together with the same stuff at the same time. They're all watching the same things, so their references are all the same, and their experiences are the same. Therefore, what they talk about the next work around, as they used to say, the water cooler is the same. And they're all shocked in the same way and surprised in the same way. And in a funny sort of way, it was kind of like early newspapers where early communities only got information out of a newspaper and they'd all read the same stuff. And therefore, they all reacted, in similar sort of ways using the same sort of information. And whilst it was kind of limiting in some ways, it was also incredibly binding because everyone's laughing at the same things and we're sharing the same things and we've got common values and common experiences. So I still find that kind of amazing. And then when we ended up doing my shows on telly, we were just at that at the very final peak of the power of TV before it got fragmented by cable TV, pay TV, satellite, and then this new medium that you've described called the internet.
Interweb. Yep.
And interweb, which is incredibly fragmenting. So when I was on TV, which I'm sure we'll get to, that was kind of the very last heyday and probably the most powerful it ever was of TV at its height, reaching the most people in Australia. 4 channels, 4 shows. People are watching 1 of 4 things on telly and experiencing it. And so if you've got a popular show like, Fast Forward, for example, which is the most popular show on telly for a given week, you've got, on a really good share, which we did have, up to 40% of all sets in use are watching that at any time and even more, which means that there's several million people in Australia out of Australia's population then was, in its mid-20 millions. 4 or 5 million of those people are watching your show. And that's an incredible privilege in a way, and incredible fun.
Absolutely.
An incredible thing to experiment with as well. An incredible influence, really.
It is. And I think it's sadly missed now. We did have that period of Fast Forward, Tonight Live, all those things that we'll talk about. And it really was water cooler. There weren't the amount of choices. You still get it to a varying degree, like with The Last of Us and maybe The White Lotus. People still have common experience.
The world. Yeah, and you get massive phenomena like Taylor Swift or people, but they're global phenomena, and that's the point, that it was rather that regions and countries that aren't subject to global phenomena could have their own experiences that held them together, and they weren't bound together by these all-encompassing global things that came in over the top. And that was the power. And so small countries like Australia or, small European countries, Finland or Norway or other places, could be held together by their shared experiences and not swamped by these giant global things. That was the power of it.
When we talk about your career later on.
Is that episode 3 or 4 we're going to get to my career?
I think it'll be around 8.
8.
At this rate,
That's good.
certainly 8.
Good.
Yep.
Mm.
But
Yeah, at
globalization
this rate.
has globalization really has changed that aspect. We lived in the
Yeah,
great time of shared experience. And
that's
I'm
right.
going to throw chronology out the window straight away because you mentioned GTV9 and IMT, and
Yeah.
you had a special connection with Graham Kennedy.
When I was approached to do TV, I needed to get some writers around me super quick sticks. So I used all the people and approached all the people I'd been at uni with, who we'd mucked around with. And they were people like Peter Moon and Alan Pentland and Michael Veitch. And in an earlier incarnation, it had been Glenn Robbins and Ian McFadgen, Marianne Fay, just a whole lot of people that I'd done reviews with and been doing sketch comedy shows with, doing around the traps at theatre restaurants after I'd left uni. And so I had them. But in addition, I thought it might be useful to get someone who's actually worked in television before, because none of us had. We were literally uni students suddenly who were let loose on TV. So I found a bloke called Mike McCall Jones. And Mike McCall Jones' name I had known growing up because he'd been the head writer on the Don Lane Show, which was the most powerful variety show in Australia. And he was also had been the head writer, and I still can't believe this, for Graham Kennedy for all of his shows going through those eras from the early days of TV in the late 1950s, early 60s. He'd been the writer and worked with Graham and worked with him every day, written topical jokes, got in early every day, read the papers, typed up his jokes, a couple of pages, walked them over, sat with Graham as he edited them and crossed out the good ones and reworked them so they're more in his vernacular. And then as the show came and it was live at that night, so it was a long day, you know, they'd had rehearsals and they had live bands and everything. He'd walk across with Graham from his caravan out on the lot. It was like MGM, all the way through these sort of labyrinth of corridors that used to be GTV9, past loading bays and scenery workshops and makeup rooms and all sorts of stuff, all that way through to the studio where they were shooting. The audience was already in, they'd been warmed up, and the band would play the theme song, and Mike McCall Jones would stand with Graham behind as he smoked a couple of smokes, because he always had a smoke before he went on. And then he would watch Graham go out, and then he'd walk around to the camera 3, I think it was, in front, the one that was the close-up, straight in front of the desk, stand there and watch every single show that he did. Watch him. And if he thought of a joke, he'd scribble it down on a bit of cardboard and hold it up, or a line. But he'd watch Graham do all of the jokes that he'd written that day and ad lib, interview people, do live reads, everything. So he was a man, Mike McCall Jones, was the most experienced you could be in doing live TV. And so I got Mike over to help us. And Mike couldn't believe how ignorant we were. We loved TV. We wanted to make shows. And we were at Channel 7. And he thought, boy, have I got some work to do here. So Mike became kind of the first person that helped me, and had worked with Graham when I was doing my Tonight Show. So when I was asked to do a Tonight Show at the end of 1989, and Seven said, would you do one? Mike basically said, well, here's what it's how they make them. Here's how we've made them at 9. Here's how they make them in America, you know, for Carson or Letterman. And this is how a day looks, because it's you know, you're every day you're churning out a show. It's like making a paper every day. So you need to understand the mechanics of what you need to do. So he was brilliant at saying all of that sort of stuff and help get that in order. And so he basically helped me set all of that up. But then he did another thing too. He, I think, started sending tapes of our show before we ever did our show, rehearsals. I think he must have run Graham Kennedy, who was now in Sydney and a legend, and was doing his own show, Coast to Coast.
Coast to Coast, yes.
Which was dominating TV late night. I think he must have sent some tapes or something up, because I got a phone call after my first year on TV making Fast Forward. It must have been about October or November. And we were thinking about whether we'd do a Tonight Show the next year. I'd been asked to do one.
Yes.
And so we were mucking around, and I got a phone call, and it was Melissa Moore, who said,
Yes.
"Oh, it's Graham Kennedy's on the phone." And I thought, "Oh, yeah, you're right. Who's this? This will be Andrew Knight or someone's having a to me." And I picked up the phone, and it was Graham. And Graham said, "Oh, look, I'd love to catch up with you if you're in Sydney." And I said, "Well, I actually don't get up to Sydney that much," but I suddenly thought, I can be in Sydney tomorrow. So I got up to Sydney, and we ended up having lunch. And the lunch went literally, I remember it distinctly. He lived over the other side of the harbour from town, drove over there around sort of Potts Point or somewhere, I can't remember where, found his favourite local restaurant, met him at 12:30, sat there, and we got on like a house on fire, and we ended up having lunch all day. So we started at 12:30 and went till, I think, about 6 or 7. And so we talked and talked and talked, and it was the most fascinating lunch. And at the end of it, he said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" I said, "No, well, nothing really." He said, "Do you want to have lunch again tomorrow?" So we had another lunch the same the next day. I stayed overnight. We had the same thing. And I was fascinated just to hear him talk about his experiences of TV,
Yes.
writing, guests, dealing with management and everything. And he just downloaded everything. And he got a sense of me as well, I think,
Yes.
because I think he was, my sense of it was that he was feeling me out to find out whether I would actually be doing a Tonight Show in competition with him the next year on Coast to
Right.
Coast. He finally got to that kind of on day 2, halfway through, because he sort of said, I'm thinking about whether I'll do Coast to Coast next year. And then he sort of said, "Oh, Mike tells me that you're doing a few things," and he wanted to know what we were looking at. I kind of felt obliged to say, "We're looking at doing a Tonight Show, and it's going to be, Letterman, Carson, Don Lane sort of mix all of those things together." And he said, "Oh, that's interesting." And then he said, "I'm sort of iffy about whether I'll go. I've done my thing on Coast to Coast." Anyhow, but we finished up, and then I didn't hear from Graham for a few weeks, but the next week in the paper it said, "Kennedy's not coming back to do Coast to Coast." And I knew that's where he was heading in our chat, and he was obviously mulling it over. But I found that and I saw him a couple of other times after that as well. We had lunches. Mike always regarded him as the king of live TV. Mike said, and he'd worked with Bert, and he regarded Bert as a genius of live TV. I think he said of Bert, a bit like Carson, you could put him in a revolving chair in a studio and spin it around, and Bert would come up smiling on the camera that had the red light on. He said
Yes.
he had a genius knack of knowing where the camera was and how to relate to it, which is, a gift, a rare
Yes.
gift.
Absolutely. You don't think Kennedy was sounding you out to be his heir apparent on Coast to Coast?
I don't know. We never got that far because it became apparent that we were loving doing Fast Forward, which was
Yes.
a sketch show, and that's how he'd seen me. He'd only seen me doing sketches and things of that nature, being characters, because it turned out he'd watched every episode of Fast Forward and he really loved it. He knew all the characters, he knew all the sketches. He wanted to know who'd done the writing, how we came up with our characters. He was steeped in showbiz. He was highly literate in the creation of comedy and of entertainment and drama and TV. And he knew music theatre. He knew a lot about musical theatre, and I love musical theatre too. So we were talking a lot about all the musicals he'd like. He was fully up to speed in all the young talent that was around at the time. He knew all the names of Ian McFadden and Marianne Faye and Glenn. He knew all of this. He knew the business. And he had strong views about what was funny and what wasn't, like some of the stuff he thought we were doing, he thought was less than great. Some of it he thought was fantastic. And we talked about that ad nauseum. We also talked about rehearsing. I said that because I'm a writer, I know what we're going to do, and therefore I'm fully alive to where it's going, what its possibilities are, because we've made it up. And in a way, the writing of it is kind of a pre-rehearsal, the earliest rehearsal you can have. And
Yes.
I said that I like to rehearse things and know where they're going to go. And he then spent a lot of time saying he rehearsed everything. All those ad libs he did, most of those were written. He would rehearse all those live ads that he did every day till he got the best angle on them. And then the trick of it was to make it look as though it was happening fresh. But
Yes.
he made it very clear that he worked in a very similar way. And it's an illusion in a way. And there is a freshness because you don't know exactly how it's going to unfold. But basically, you're equipped with the armament of all of the ad libs and the ones, how you unload them and when you unload them and the order that they come out in will be surprising. And things would arise, and he basically didn't like surprises. He liked to be in control. But because it yielded the best results. And I find it amazing. I've talked to a lot of people who've gone into TV and they've either succeeded or not succeeded. But their starting point is, we won't rehearse because we want it to look fresh, or we don't want to know. We'll just turn up and miraculously something will happen. Well, no, it won't. Any more than monkeys sort of typing and hoping Shakespeare's going to come out. Something might come out, but if you want to do something that's of a certain caliber night after night after night, as he did, and you want to make sure that you've got the best chance of it being of a good quality, you better rehearse. I mean,
Yes, and
it's
you
kind of
have to
showbiz.
equip the machine around you as well.
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, if you want people to cover it on cameras and sound guys to actually make sure that it's mic'd up
Yes.
and that it's communicated to an audience using the technology, it kind of helps if everyone's on the same page. You can occasionally follow things, and you've directed it a lot with me particularly. You'll follow stuff as it's happening. But people don't realize, you know it intimately, there's this massive machinery that needs to cover things. And you can do that to a certain amount, but the more you can be prepared, the better the result's going to be.
That's right. If you make contingencies for various situations.
But the whole thing can't be a contingency, I guess, is the bottom line.
Yes.
It's one thing to say we'll allow for contingencies over structure, but what you can't have is the whole thing being subject to chance.
Okay, so now
I wish we'd known that a lot earlier.
Yeah. Can we go back and redo those shows?
Yeah, there'd be a lot to redo. There'd be roughly 1,000.
So I'll go back. You were a lawyer. What's not known is what you actually did.
I did sort of, it's called intellectual property. So intellectual property is basically the law around copyright and ideas, concepts and stuff like that. Film law, TV law, patents to do with creating inventions and things of that. That's all called intellectual property. So I kind of was interested in that very early on. And so I ended up being a partner in a law firm that looked after that stuff. And then I ended up going overseas looking after some big companies that were sort of trying to commercialize ideas that were built around new innovations and new ways of making. One of them was a new way of making steel, because I'm intimately interested in steel making. I remember when I started, they put you through all the areas, and I went to this most conservative law firm called Weigel and Crowther. It was the most conservative law firm. And as it turned out, it was a really useful thing for where I ended up in television in two ways. One is because it gave me a commercial background, but two, the people that would come in seeking legal advice were gobsmacking what had happened to them. Like I remember when we were doing Fast Forward, I would do, which you can't do now, Indian rug salesman, which was
Yes.
basically the idea that was born in real life of those rug merchants having shops in Melbourne. It was up and down Chapel Street that were in permanent liquidation. They were always shutting down. 3 days to go. We were closing for good, no more. And then the fourth day would come, and miraculously they're still there. 6 months would pass, and who would think they're still there? And so I'd been at this law firm for about 2 weeks, and the senior partner, Mr. Cooper, said, I want you to meet the proprietor of one of these places, because he was permanently getting sued. He was always getting sued. Not only was he permanently closing down, but some of the misrepresentations about the rugs that he would make were the greatest piece of bullshit you have ever heard in your life. And so I remember he came in, this bloke whose name I won't say, and he said, oh, Steve, it's terrible, terrible. And he had this list. He had a pile of writs and statements of claims. He was being sued he had stores in South Australia and Queensland and everywhere. And he had this bloody pile of, it was a foot high, of people who were suing him. And so he went through them, and everyone got worse than the other one. The things that he had said to sell a rug, you couldn't make it up. But his best one was one from South Australia, where, and I read it, it said the defendant, him, had, and it was all in legalese, but the guts of it was that this doctor from South Australia had gone into his shop and had been told by him that the rug that was the very rare rug that was being sold had been an ancient Persian rug that had come from a museum in Paris. When the Germans invaded Paris, they had taken the rug from the museum and they'd taken it back to Hitler's bunker. What had possessed him to say this is beyond me. And that this indeed was the rug that was in Hitler's bunker. And that and in fact, he'd gone so far as to say that one of the stains on the rug was where Hitler had killed himself. And so this doctor, buyer beware. I mean, there's a certain amount of due diligence you should do. Anyhow, he paid a fortune for this bloody rug, and it turned out that the rug had been made in Afghanistan about 12 years before, and it was worth about $300, and nothing like. The bloke had paid tens of thousands of dollars for this rug, for this allegedly museum quality rug. Some of the bullshit that he would say. So when we were doing Fast Forward and we were desperate to get some characters up, I just thought, these rug salesmen are fantastic. These guys are great, because I would go in there to meet him to get the next lot of writs, and I was only sort of first year out of uni, and he goes, Steve, they're trying to get me. Some of the, it's terrible. They're all after me. Like he was being persecuted. No, it's because some of the bullshit that's coming out of your mouth. So there was a Monty to do sketches about. But it's interesting we're on this topic, John, because it was never attacking their race or their ethnic background. It was rather that they were way too sharp by half, and it was a phenomena, and that was the thing that was of interest. This sort of permanently closing down, permanently bullshitting was the thing about it. And anyone who'd driven up or down any streets in any capital city of Australia had experienced this, had seen these permanent closing down sales. So
it's interesting because you love this shirt, and this is apparently a Persian original.
It is, and I can see that clearly came from a bunker and should have been left there, really, that I can see. I remember there was another case when I was a lawyer. There was some of the cases. There was a bloke who was because I just sit there. I was only sort of 24 or some 25, and they'd come in and you'd meet these people, and they gave you all of the ones that we were a commercial law firm, but occasionally you get personal injuries. So I got this personal injuries, and I knew nothing about personal injuries. And a bloke had came in, and his name was Bozo, something. He was a rodeo clown, and his name was Gerald, in inverted commas, Bozo, such and such. And he was a rodeo clown, and he was being sued by another rodeo clown, because what had happened was they both, and it was all in the statement of claim, they both, in a rodeo, you do have to get the bulls away from the performers and stuff. But you've also got a trademark little act that you entertain with people in these rodeos as they go around the country. And Bozo's act consisted of putting gelignite into a dunny and blowing himself up into the air. It was a controlled act, apparently. I mean, I was only, and I said, really? He said, oh, yeah, it's specialist stuff. Anyhow, he said what he was being sued for is that this other clown, I can't remember his sort of working name, but the other clown had stolen his toilet act of getting blown up in the air. So they were working together on one rodeo together, and Bozo was really still quite bitter that the other bloke was using his blowing up in the air toilet act. So he said he went and put some extra sticks of gelignite in the bloke's toilet before he set
See
fire
where this is going. Yep.
And apparently the other clown just didn't go up a little bit. The other clown went, he flew up into the air, and he came down with major injuries. And Bozo kind of pleaded ignorance, but the word got out that he'd sort of stuck some extra sticks of gelignite in the dunny, and so now he was being sued. So you have to sit straight-faced when you're hearing these stories. But when I was hearing these stories and struggling to keep a straight face, I knew I wasn't long for the law. I literally couldn't do it. It just did.
Who says the law is boring?
Yeah,
But,
I know.
Many great comedians, particularly, came through that path, and architects.
Sean McAuliffe, Rebel Wilson is a lawyer.
Charlie
Pickering is a lawyer. So many lawyers. Ronnie is a lawyer.
Yep.
There are a ton of lawyers, and they all got out. They couldn't get out quick enough. I think several things. One is because law is about ideas, and so comedy's about ideas. Law is about words. The law is all about using words, and then law is also about theatricality. Not necessarily a suburban law firm, although you are dealing with clients, but certainly going into a courtroom and representing someone or making an appearance, being a barrister, the judge, the whole theatricality, the drama of a courtroom is kind of a theatrical event in a way, isn't it? But it's never as reasoned as that. But when I was thinking about what I was going to do, I remember there were courtroom dramas. There was Rumpole of the Old Bailey was a great show, beautiful, based on a book by John Mortimer, the great English Queen's Counsel, who'd written
starring Leo McKern.
Leo McKern had written his memoirs about being at the Old Bailey, and it had been turned into a drama series. So I would watch that and think, oh, that looks good. That looks fun. Not realizing that it was that it was completely manufactured. And then they had other law shows on telly from America. There was one called Petrocelli, which was about this guy who was a lawyer who represented people, but he seemed to be driving around a lot and having a good time more than being. And I had it in my head because we were asked to make decisions as 17-year-olds about what we were going to do the rest of our lives, which is about the most ludicrous idea you can have. Let's get a young person who is barely stable anyway, and who's just finished the worst year of their life, their VCE or HSC or whatever you call it, and get them and give them a 2-week window when they've finally got some results, and give them probably 20 minutes with a careers counsellor, and get them to pick what they're going to do for the rest of their life forever. Let's
Well,
do.
particularly, you didn't even have the option to be an influencer in those days.
No, we couldn't be an influencer in those days, which was clearly where I would have chosen to go had I had the option. But so in a way, you sort of make it on half rational and half irrational grounds. And mine were, I'd watch Rumpole, and I'd watch Petrocelli and a few other movies, things like that. So we ended up at uni studying law and doing philosophy as well. And that's why I chose law. And I sort of suspect that those other people kind of would have had their version, Rebel
Yes.
and Ronnie and Dawn and Charlie would have had their version of doing the same thing, of because of the eloquence that was involved and the theatricality that might be involved and the whole business, but really probably more of a placeholder.
You mentioned going to uni, and like so many performing greats, you appeared in the Melbourne Review. I think you were actually instrumental in creating it.
Yeah, when we went to uni, they had an architects review, which was put on by the architects, people studying architecture at Melbourne Uni.
Also comedians, many
But
comedians
it was
come from architecture.
it was called an Archie Review, but it was a chance for people across from any faculty, and they'd advertise it in Farrago because everything was done by written word or spoken word in those days. There was no internet, so there was a weekly publication, a student newspaper called Farrago, and I remember seeing an ad for the Archie Review. So a friend of mine, Roger Wallace, and I wrote some sketches, went along and read them. And the bloke who was the director, who was just a year older than us, said, "You're in." And we thought, "Oh, God, is that standard that bad?" But, and then we said, "Which sketches did you like?" And they said, all of them, because we'd written about 12 sketches. And, geez. And then we heard some of the other sketches and could see where he was coming from. And he not just said, "We'll use the sketches." He said, "You have to perform them." So that was kind of a bit of a... Anyhow, we'd had a good time reading them. We thought, "Oh, well, it'll be like, a Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney kind of movie of putting a show on." So it was like that. There was just a whole lot of like-minded people who were our age mucking around and putting on a show. And they'd sell the bloody things out. It was in a great theatre at Melbourne Uni. And, it held several hundred. And it was over sort of a week, and they'd all be sold out. There were other students and friends of family had come along, and it was really there was nothing else to do probably. So, and we got laughs, couldn't believe it. So I remember one of the people in the audience owned a theatre restaurant, the Flying Trapeze, down in Brunswick Street in Fitzroy. And the theatre restaurants were basically just shops that had been set up, and some tables had been put on. So instead of having a clothing shop, they'd gutted the joint, put, a dozen tables in there, turned what was probably a really ordinary kitchen out the back into a commercial kitchen against any planning law and against anything to do with hygiene. And they'd serve food every night, and I use that term loosely, and then they'd put a show on, this tiny little stage that was built, and they'd get people cheaply to do it. And so we looked cheap and we could get some laughs. So we went and did the Christmas show at the Flying Trapeze. So we went literally from doing the Archie Review to doing the Christmas show at the Flying Trapeze. And we couldn't believe it. Roger, me, got a couple of other blokes who'd done the Archie Review, standing in front of a crowd. I would say crowd, it was probably about 60 people. Who was suffering from food poisoning and half pissed, and who'd driven in from Ringwood to see a show and paid like nothing. They probably paid $30, and we got paid for a night. I think we got paid like $20 or something. It was really, it was big bucks, and but we couldn't believe our luck. We're in showbiz, and it was way better than working in a shop or sort of doing some other holiday job. So that was my first experience of getting paid to be in showbiz. It was fantastic.
And a huge percentage of great Australian performers have come through the reviews.
Well, at that time, there was a huge number of people, both at Monash Uni and Melbourne Uni, doing those sorts of things. So there was at Melbourne, there was Ian McFadden, Mary Ann Fay, Glenn Robbins, and I'm missing a whole lot of others who were sort of our contemporaries. Not long after, there was all the working Rob Sitch and Tom Gleisner and Santo and all of those.
And Rob is actually a qualified doctor.
That's right. Rob was doing medicine. So in a way, people had no intention of being practicing what they'd studied. And then similarly, going through the theatre restaurants were Wendy Harmer and a whole lot of other people who were. She was a journalist, but people who were experimenting and trying stuff out. I remember, and there was the funnel of people, because they had once a week, they had tryout nights. And Rod Quantock and Mary Keneally, who were a little bit older than us, with Alan Pentland and Jeff Brooks and Steve Blackburn, they were a year older, but they seemed so much older because they'd already done a show called Australia Standing At. And
yes.
they'd set up their own theatre restaurant called with an upstairs called the Banana Lounge, where they would do tryouts every week. One night a week was a tryout. And I remember going up there and seeing a few people do tryouts, and we were up ourselves because we had our own show. So, it was very high. We'd already had 3 weeks up our sleeve of doing this in front of audiences of 60. So we were a little up ourselves. So we'd go and watch the tryouts and sort of say, what do they know? But I remember sitting in the tryout because you could get free grog. That's why we went. And we were sitting there having free grog, watching the tryout at the Banana Lounge. And Jana Wendt, who later became one of the doyens of the Australian kind of journal,
absolutely a legend.
TV, won gold Logies, became a kind of the mainstay of a current affair for years. Was a uni student at Melbourne Uni. She's quite beautiful, and she did a tryout singing folk songs on a guitar.
Wow.
But she never could get. We went up and we could see this beautiful girl who was ready to go on, but she didn't have the guts to go on, so she never went on. She conked out before she got on stage.
I don't remember her ever singing folk songs on 60 Minutes either.
No, that was a missed opportunity. That show would be running and rating higher if it had opened itself up to folk music. But so many people who went on to do things. Richard Stubbs, the list is as long as your arm. Peter Rosethorn, just dozens and dozens came through that theatre restaurant scene that was really kind of loosely attached to Melbourne Uni, RMIT as well. And so there was this great sort of entanglement of uni with young people with time on their hands, being encouraged as we were to be creative at that time, to try things out, to write for the newspaper, to write shows. And there was a student union too that encouraged people to put on their own shows. They'd subsidise them. And with student theatre, I don't know if they have it so much these days. So people were always putting on reviews and trying stuff out. When TV finally said, we might have a look at this comedy area because this looks kind of profitable and Australians might want to watch it, there was this whole proven, tested, kind of semi-practiced population of young artists who were ready to go. And they'd practiced a fair bit too. They'd stood in front of audiences and tested material. And they were really good. We were really good at writing stuff. We'd whip stuff up the whole time, so we're very experienced at writing. So there was a whole realm of young writer-performers ready to go that could be almost picked up and given an opportunity in TV, which is what happened.
Well, it gives a new perspective to how that all happened, and we'll get to the 11th Hour in a minute, which really harnessed that.
We're not even up to 1987 yet.
Right. Okay.
This is going to go for about 15 hours at this rate.
I've got time. What about you?
Yeeks. I might have to have a coffee break at some point.
While Steve has a coffee break, here's what's in store for part 2. How do you do this when you're not qualified, as it were, in film?
Just have a go. In the same way as we weren't qualified to write plays. I mean, what does it take to be qualified? You read up, you study, you look and learn, and then you have a go. And you learn on the way through. He rang up a few of us and said, listen, I think I can get a show or an opportunity at Channel 7. So we called ourselves the 11th Hour. And that we were that group of people. We did a sketch comedy show. And it was in the tradition of not the 9 o'clock news or, this was the week that was David Frost. Ian was the producer. And we would go in there with a handful of sketches. I don't think we even rehearsed them. We just read them out once or twice and then shoot them. Mark did a prototype of Con the Fruiterer. Mary Ann did the prototype of Kylie Mole. Glenn did the prototype of Uncle Arthur. All of the characters that then kind of went on and became famous.
The process of Fast Forward, you had a live night, you had to make an hour a week.
So if you're making an hour of TV a week, an hour of sketches a week, there's a technical term for it. It's called a shitload. All of those people were, at least to some degree, writer-performers. Yes. They could either write their own material, or even if they couldn't write sketches, could give an indication to writers of what they found funny, or could do characters that the writers could work with. So they were writer-performers in some sense. And that's really important, I think. So we're already well down the track over just having actors.